The autumn wind howled through the barren fields of Millbrook, Massachusetts, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and the promise of a harsh winter. Jacob Whitmore pulled his worn coat tighter around his shoulders as he made his way back to his modest cabin, the day's meager harvest weighing heavy in the burlap sack slung over his back. The year was 1692, and the shadow of the Salem witch trials still loomed large over New England, casting suspicion on anyone who dared to live differently. Jacob's weathered hands trembled slightly as he fumbled with the wooden latch of his door. At 43, he looked older than his years, his face etched with lines of hardship and solitude. The other colonists of Millbrook kept their distance from him, whispering behind closed doors about his mysterious past and the circumstances that had brought him to their small community 5 years prior. Some said he had fled from accusations of heresy in Boston. Others claimed he had been cast out for consorting with undesirable elements. The truth, as Jacob knew it, was far simpler and far more painful. He had lost everything in a fire that claimed his wife and 2 young children, and had come to Millbrook seeking nothing more than a place to grieve in peace. The interior of his cabin was sparse but clean, furnished with only the bare necessities: a rough-hewn table, 2 wooden chairs, a simple bed, and a stone fireplace that provided both warmth and a means to cook his modest meals. Jacob set down his sack and began sorting through the day's harvest. A few potatoes, some turnips, and a handful of apples from the gnarled tree behind his home. It wasn't much, but it would sustain him through another week if he was careful. As he prepared to light the fire, a sharp knock echoed through the cabin. Jacob froze, his hand hovering over the flint. Visitors were rare, especially at this hour when the sun was beginning to set and most God-fearing folk were preparing for evening prayers. The knock came again, more insistent this time, followed by a voice that seemed to carry an otherworldly weight. "Good sir, I beseech thee for shelter and sustenance. I am but a weary traveler in service of the Lord." Jacob approached the door cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. Through the small window, he could see the silhouette of a man standing in the gathering darkness. The stranger was tall and gaunt, dressed in simple brown robes that seemed to absorb what little light remained in the sky. His face was partially obscured by a hood, but Jacob could make out the glint of intense eyes that seemed to pierce through the glass. "Who are you, stranger?" Jacob called through the door, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am Ezekiel, a humble servant of the Almighty," the man replied, his voice carrying a strange resonance that seemed to vibrate through the wooden walls. "I have traveled far to bring word of his coming judgment, and I seek only a place to rest my weary bones and perhaps a morsel of food to sustain me on my journey." Jacob's hand hesitated on the latch. Every instinct told him to turn the stranger away, to bar the door and wait for morning. But his conscience, shaped by years of strict Puritan upbringing, reminded him of the sacred duty of hospitality. Scripture commanded that he welcome the stranger, for in doing so he might be entertaining angels unaware. And in these dark times, when suspicion and fear ruled the hearts of men, perhaps showing kindness to a fellow servant of God would be seen as a sign of his own righteousness. With a deep breath, Jacob lifted the latch and opened the door. The stranger stepped into the light, and Jacob got his first clear look at the man who called himself Ezekiel. He was indeed tall, perhaps 6.5 feet, with long, unkempt hair the color of ash, and a beard that reached nearly to his chest. His skin was pale and seemed to have an almost translucent quality, as if he had spent years away from the sun. But it was his eyes that truly unsettled Jacob. They were a pale blue, almost colorless, and they seemed to look not at him but through him, as if seeing something beyond the physical world. "I thank thee for thy kindness, brother," Ezekiel said, stepping across the threshold. "The Lord shall surely bless thee for thy generosity to his humble servant." Jacob nodded, closing the door behind the stranger, and immediately feeling the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "You are welcome to share what little I have," he said, gesturing toward the table. "I was just about to prepare my evening meal." As Jacob busied himself with lighting the fire and preparing food, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every time he glanced toward Ezekiel, the man seemed to be studying him with those unsettling eyes, as if taking measure of his soul. The stranger had taken a seat at the table but had not removed his hood, leaving his face partially in shadow despite the growing warmth from the fireplace. "Tell me, brother Jacob," Ezekiel said suddenly, causing Jacob to start and nearly drop the pot he was holding. "How did you know my name? I don't recall." "The Lord reveals all things to those who serve him faithfully," Ezekiel interrupted, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "He has told me much about thee, Jacob Whitmore, about thy losses, thy grief, thy desperate search for redemption." Jacob's blood ran cold. He had never told anyone in Millbrook about his past, about the fire that had claimed his family. The few details that had emerged had come from his own careful admissions, and even then he had shared only the barest facts. How could this stranger know such intimate details of his life? I don't understand," Jacob stammered, setting down the pot with shaking hands. Ezekiel leaned forward, his pale eyes gleaming in the firelight. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, brother. He has brought me to thy door for a purpose, just as he brought thee to this place of exile and penance. Tonight we shall break bread together, and I shall share with thee the visions he has granted me. Visions of what is to come, of the great reckoning that approaches like a storm on the horizon." Jacob felt a chill run down his spine, but he forced himself to continue preparing the meal. Perhaps this was indeed a test of his faith, a chance to prove his devotion to God despite the hardships he had endured. As he ladled the simple stew into 2 wooden bowls, he tried to push aside his growing unease and focus on the sacred duty of hospitality. Outside, the wind continued to howl, and the first drops of rain began to patter against the windows. Inside the small cabin, 2 men sat down to share a meal, unaware that this simple act of kindness would set in motion events that would forever change the quiet village of Millbrook and challenge everything Jacob believed about faith, redemption, and the true nature of divine judgment. The stew was simple: potatoes, turnips, and a few scraps of salted pork that Jacob had been saving for the approaching winter. As they ate, in the flickering candlelight, Ezekiel spoke in measured tones about his travels throughout New England, describing the various communities he had visited and the messages he had delivered. His voice had a hypnotic quality that seemed to draw Jacob in, despite his growing unease. "I have walked through villages where sin festers like an open wound," Ezekiel said, his pale eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "Places where the faithful have grown complacent, where they believe their prayers and Sunday worship are sufficient to cleanse them of their transgressions. But the Lord sees all, Jacob. He sees the adultery hidden behind closed doors, the greed that drives men to cheat their neighbors, the pride that makes them believe they are righteous while their hearts remain black as coal." Jacob nodded slowly, though something in the stranger's tone made him uncomfortable. There was an intensity to Ezekiel's words that went beyond typical religious fervor, a hunger that seemed almost predatory. "In Concord, I witnessed the Lord's judgment upon a merchant who had been watering down his milk and selling it to widows at full price," Ezekiel continued, taking a slow spoonful of stew. "The man's cattle began to sicken and die, one by one, until he was left with nothing but empty fields and the weight of his sins. In Lexington, a woman who had been spreading false witness about her neighbors found her own tongue swollen and blackened, unable to speak for a fortnight until she confessed her lies before the entire congregation." "Surely these were coincidences," Jacob said quietly, though his voice lacked conviction. "The Lord works through natural means, not through natural means." Ezekiel's laugh was cold and sharp. "Tell me, Jacob, Was it natural means that brought fire to thy home in Boston? Was it natural means that took thy wife Sarah and thy children little Mary and Thomas, while thou wert away at market? Jacob's spoon clattered to the table, his face draining of color. How do you know their names? How could you possibly? I told thee, the Lord reveals all things to his faithful servants. Ezekiel leaned back in his chair, his pale eyes never leaving Jacob's face. He has shown me the night thy family perished, Jacob. I have seen thy wife's final moments as the flames consumed thy home, heard thy children's cries as the smoke filled their lungs, and I have seen thee standing in the ashes the next morning, cursing God for his cruelty. Tears began to stream down Jacob's weathered cheeks. The memories he had tried so hard to bury came flooding back. The acrid smell of smoke, the collapsed beams of his home, the small bodies he had pulled from the rubble. I was weak, he whispered. I spoke in anger and grief. I have repented of those words 1,000 times. Repentance, Ezekiel mused, as if tasting the word. Such a simple concept, yet so few truly understand its meaning. Tell me, Jacob, what dost thou believe repentance requires? Sorrow for one's sins. Jacob replied automatically, reciting the catechism he had learned as a child. Confession before God and a sincere desire to turn from wickedness. And sacrifice, Ezekiel added, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. True repentance requires sacrifice, Jacob. The shedding of blood to wash away the stains of sin. In the Old Covenant, the priests offered lambs and bulls upon the altar. But in these latter days, the Lord requires a different kind of offering. Jacob felt his stomach turn, though he couldn't quite understand why. There was something in Ezekiel's tone, something in the way his eyes seemed to gleam with an unholy light that filled him with dread. What kind of offering? He asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. Ezekiel reached into his robes and withdrew a leather-bound book, its cover stained and worn with age. The binding was unlike anything Jacob had ever seen. The leather seemed to have an odd texture, almost like skin, and the metal clasps that held it shut were tarnished black. Strange symbols were carved into the cover, symbols that hurt to look at directly and seemed to shift and writhe in the candlelight. This tome contains the true revelations of the Lord, Ezekiel said, running his fingers lovingly over the book's surface. Visions granted to the faithful throughout the ages, prophecies of the great cleansing that must come before the establishment of his kingdom on earth. Would thou like to hear what it says about thy village, Jacob, about the sins that fester here in Millbrook like a cancer in the body of Christ? Jacob wanted to say no, wanted to demand that the stranger leave his home immediately. But something compelled him to nod, as if his will was no longer entirely his own. Ezekiel smiled, a cold, predatory expression that revealed teeth that seemed too sharp, too white. The stranger opened the book, and Jacob caught a glimpse of pages covered in text, written in what appeared to be dried blood. The language was unlike anything he had ever seen. Not Latin or Greek or Hebrew, but something far older and more primitive. As Ezekiel began to read, however, the words seemed to translate themselves in Jacob's mind, filling his consciousness with images of terrible beauty and horrific purpose. Behold, the Lord shall come with fire, and with his chariots like a whirlwind, to render his anger with fury and his rebuke with flames of fire, Ezekiel intoned, his voice taking on an otherworldly resonance. For by fire and by his sword will the Lord plead with all flesh, and the slain of the Lord shall be many. They that sanctify themselves and purify themselves in the gardens behind one tree in the midst, eating swine's flesh, and the abomination and the mouse shall be consumed together, saith the Lord. As the words washed over him, Jacob began to see visions, not with his eyes, but directly in his mind. He saw the village of Millbrook as if from a great height, its small houses and farms spread out like a map. But overlaying this familiar scene were images of corruption and sin, Deacon Morrison counting coins by candlelight, money stolen from the church's poor box. Goodwife Fletcher meeting secretly with a traveling merchant while her husband worked in the fields. Young Samuel Hartwell desecrating the Sabbath by hunting in the woods instead of attending services. "The Lord has shown me the truth about thy neighbors, Jacob," Ezekiel continued, his voice seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "They smile and nod when they see thee, but in their hearts they despise thee. They whisper that thou art cursed, that the fire that claimed thy family was God's judgment upon thee for some hidden sin. They would see thee driven from their midst if they dared, cast out into the wilderness to die alone and forgotten." The visions intensified, showing Jacob scenes of the villagers gathered in secret meetings, discussing his fate. He saw Reverend Blackwood shaking his head sadly as he spoke of the dark cloud that seemed to follow Jacob wherever he went. He saw the town selectmen debating whether to revoke his right to remain in Millbrook, whether to force him to move on to some other community where his presence wouldn't be a constant reminder of God's wrath. "But the Lord has a different plan," Ezekiel said, closing the book with a soft thud. "He has brought me here to offer thee a choice, Jacob Whitmore. Thou canst continue to live as thou hast, scraping out a meager existence while thy neighbors plot against thee, slowly starving in body and soul until death claims thee. Or thou canst embrace thy true purpose, become an instrument of divine justice, and help bring about the great cleansing that must come." Jacob blinked, the visions fading as he found himself back in his small cabin, staring across the table at the pale stranger. His head was pounding, and he felt as if he had been running for miles. "I don't understand," he said weakly. "What are you asking of me?" Ezekiel smiled again, and this time Jacob was certain that his teeth were indeed too sharp, too numerous. "I am asking thee to trust in the Lord's plan, Jacob, to open thy heart to his will and allow him to work through thee. Tomorrow, when the sun rises, thy neighbors will see the sign of his favor upon thee. They will know that thou art chosen, that thou art blessed among men." "What sign?" Jacob asked, though he was beginning to suspect that he didn't want to know. "Blood, Jacob," Ezekiel whispered, his pale eyes gleaming with an unholy light. "The sign will be written in blood, as all true covenants must be, and when they see it, they will know that the time of judgment has come to Millbrook." Outside, the wind howled louder, and the rain began to fall in earnest, drumming against the roof like the fingers of some vast, impatient hand. Inside the cabin, Jacob stared at his strange guest and felt the last vestiges of his old life slipping away like sand through his fingers. Whatever was about to happen, he knew with terrible certainty that there would be no going back. As the evening wore on, Jacob found himself growing increasingly drowsy despite his mounting anxiety. Ezekiel had continued to speak in low, hypnotic tones about divine revelations and the approaching judgment, but his words seemed to blur together in Jacob's mind like water flowing over stones. The stranger's pale eyes never seemed to blink, and Jacob began to wonder if he was falling under some kind of spell. "Perhaps we should retire for the evening," Jacob suggested, stifling a yawn. "You must be weary from your travels, and I have work to do in the morning." Ezekiel nodded slowly, though his expression suggested that sleep was the furthest thing from his mind. "Indeed, brother, rest is important, for tomorrow will bring great changes. I shall be content to sleep by thy fire, if thou wouldst permit it." Jacob fetched a spare blanket from his meager possessions and arranged a makeshift bed near the hearth. As he did so, he couldn't shake the feeling that Ezekiel was studying his every movement, cataloguing the layout of the cabin and the location of every door and window. When Jacob glanced back at his guest, however, the stranger appeared to be deep in prayer, his lips moving silently as he clutched the strange leather-bound book to his chest. "Good night, Ezekiel," Jacob said, retreating to his small bedroom. "May the Lord grant you peaceful rest." "And may he grant thee the strength for what is to come," Ezekiel replied, his voice carrying an ominous undertone that made Jacob's skin crawl. Jacob closed the door to his bedroom and leaned against it, his heart pounding. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, to climb out his window and run into the night, but where could he go? The nearest settlement was miles away, and the storm outside was growing worse by the minute. Besides, what would he tell people? That a strange preacher had made him uncomfortable with talk of divine judgment. In these times of religious fervor and suspicion, such a story might well be turned against him. He knelt beside his bed and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, his mind was filled with the disturbing visions Ezekiel had shown him, images of his neighbors' secret sins and their whispered conversations about his fate. Were they true, or merely the product of the stranger's twisted imagination? Jacob had always suspected that some of the villagers viewed him with suspicion, but he had tried to convince himself that their coldness was simply the natural reserve of New England folk. As he finally climbed into bed, Jacob could hear Ezekiel moving about in the main room. The sounds were odd. Not the normal rustling of someone settling down for sleep, but deliberate, purposeful movements. There was a scraping sound, as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor, followed by what sounded like liquid being poured from a great height. Jacob lay still, straining to listen, but the sounds gradually faded into silence. Perhaps Ezekiel was simply performing some kind of religious ritual, preparing for his morning prayers. Many devout men had strange habits and customs, especially those who spent their lives traveling from place to place, spreading the gospel. Despite his exhaustion, sleep was slow to come. When it finally claimed him, Jacob's dreams were filled with disturbing images, rivers of blood flowing through the streets of Millbrook, his neighbors' faces twisted with fear and accusation, and always, hovering at the edge of his vision, the pale figure of Ezekiel watching with those colorless eyes. He was awakened sometime in the deep hours of the night by a sound that made his blood freeze in his veins, a low, rhythmic chanting in a language he didn't recognize. The voice was definitely Ezekiel's, but it seemed to have taken on an otherworldly quality, resonating through the walls of the cabin like the tolling of some infernal bell. Jacob crept to his bedroom door and pressed his ear against the wood. The chanting continued, rising and falling in a hypnotic cadence that seemed to vibrate in his bones. Occasionally he could make out individual words, but they were in that same strange language he had glimpsed in Ezekiel's book, harsh, guttural sounds that seemed to hurt his throat just to hear them. As he listened, Jacob became aware of other sounds accompanying the chanting, a wet, slapping noise, like meat being thrown against a wall, and a smell that began to seep under his door. The metallic scent of fresh blood mixed with something else, something organic and corrupt that made his stomach heave. The chanting grew louder, more urgent, and Jacob could hear Ezekiel moving around the main room with increasing speed. There were sounds of furniture being overturned, of liquid splashing against the walls, and underneath it all, a sound that Jacob's mind refused to process, a sound like something large and wet being dragged across the floor. Terror gripped Jacob's heart as he realized that whatever was happening in his main room, it was far beyond any normal religious ritual. He thought of the strange book Ezekiel carried, with its skin-like binding and blood-red text. He thought of the man's two sharp teeth and colorless eyes. Most of all, he thought of the visions he had been shown, visions that had felt far too real to be mere imagination. The chanting reached a crescendo, and suddenly everything went silent. Jacob held his breath, pressing his ear harder against the door, but he could hear nothing except the pounding of his own heart and the rain still pattering against the windows. Minutes passed, feeling like hours, before he finally heard the soft sound of footsteps moving toward the front door. There was a creak as the door opened, followed by the sound of wind and rain rushing into the cabin. Then the door closed again, and silence returned. Jacob waited another hour before he dared to move, his body trembling with fear and cold. When he was certain that Ezekiel had gone, he slowly opened his bedroom door and peered into the main room. What he saw there would haunt him for the rest of his days. The entire room was painted in blood, not splattered or sprayed, but carefully applied in intricate patterns that covered every surface. The walls, the ceiling, even the floor were decorated with symbols and designs that seemed to writhe and shift in the dim light from the dying fire. The furniture had been arranged in a perfect circle, with his table at the center, and on that table lay Ezekiel's leather-bound book, open to a page covered in fresh, wet blood. But it was the smell that truly overwhelmed him. Not just the metallic scent of blood, but something far worse. It was the smell of death, of corruption, of things that should have been buried long ago. It filled his nostrils and throat, making him gag and retch as he stumbled backward into his bedroom. Jacob slammed the door shut and pressed his back against it, his mind reeling with horror and disbelief. What had Ezekiel done? Where had all that blood come from? And more terrifyingly, what did it mean for Jacob and the village of Millbrook? As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through his bedroom window, Jacob heard voices outside. The voices of his neighbors, calling his name with increasing urgency. They had come, just as Ezekiel had predicted, drawn by some instinct or divine prompting to witness the sign that had been prepared for them. With shaking hands, Jacob dressed himself and prepared to face whatever judgment awaited him. As he reached for the door handle, he caught sight of his reflection in the small mirror beside his bed. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes wide with terror, but it was his hands that made him gasp in horror. They were stained with blood, fresh, red blood that hadn't been there when he went to sleep. As he stared at his crimson-stained palms, Jacob realized with dawning horror that whatever had happened in his cabin that night, he was now inextricably part of it. The sign had been written, the covenant sealed, and there would be no escape from the consequences. Outside, the voices grew louder, more insistent. Soon, they would break down his door and see what lay beyond. And when they did, Jacob knew that his life as he had known it would be over forever. The pounding on Jacob's door grew more insistent as the morning light strengthened. Through his bedroom window, he could see a crowd gathering in his yard. At least a dozen villagers, their faces grim with concern and suspicion. Deacon Morrison stood at the front of the group, his usually composed demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. "Jacob Whitmore," Morrison called out, his voice carrying the authority of his position in the church. "Open this door at once. We have heard disturbing reports about thy property this morning." Jacob's hands shook as he stared at the blood staining his palms. How had it gotten there? He had no memory of leaving his bedroom during the night, yet the evidence was undeniable. With growing dread, he realized he had no choice but to face his neighbors. Hiding would only make him appear more guilty of whatever they suspected him of. He wrapped his hands in a cloth and slowly opened his bedroom door. The sight that greeted him was even worse in the daylight streaming through the windows. The blood covering his main room had dried to a dark, rust-colored stain, but the intricate patterns were still clearly visible. The symbols seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, and Jacob had to look away to keep from being sick. The pounding on his front door intensified, and Jacob heard the sound of multiple voices raised in urgent discussion. He caught fragments of their conversation through the wooden walls. "Saw him talking to a stranger last night. Ungodly sounds coming from within, the smell of death itself." With no other choice, Jacob made his way to the front door, stepping carefully around the blood-stained patterns on the floor. As his hand touched the latch, he heard Goodwife Fletcher's voice rise above the others. "Perhaps we should fetch Reverend Blackwood before—" Jacob opened the door, and the conversation died instantly. The crowd of villagers stared at him in shocked silence, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and revulsion. It was young Samuel Hartwell who broke the silence, pointing a trembling finger at Jacob's partially visible hands. "Look at his hands! They're covered in blood!" Jacob instinctively tried to hide his stained palms, but it was too late. The crowd surged forward, and Deacon Morrison pushed past him into the cabin. The man's face went white as he took in the horrific scene within. "Dear God in heaven," Morrison whispered, his voice barely audible. "What hast thou done, Jacob Whitmore?" The other villagers crowded into the doorway, gasping and crying out in horror as they saw the blood-covered walls and ceiling. Goodwife Fletcher fainted dead away and had to be caught by her husband. Old Thomas Brewster, who had fought in King Philip's War and seen his share of violence, turned away and vomited into the bushes. "I didn't do this," Jacob said desperately, his voice cracking with emotion. "I swear before God, I had nothing to do with this. There was a stranger here last night, a man who called himself Ezekiel. He must have—" "A stranger?" Morrison's voice was sharp with disbelief. "What stranger? No one has seen any travelers on the road to Millbrook in weeks." "He came to my door at sunset," Jacob insisted, backing away from the crowd that was now pressing into his cabin. "He said he was a prophet, a servant of God. I gave him food and shelter as Scripture commands us to do, but during the night he did this." The villagers exchanged skeptical glances. Jacob could see the doubt in their eyes, the growing conviction that he was lying to cover up some unspeakable crime. Deacon Morrison walked deeper into the cabin, examining the blood-stained walls with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. "These symbols," Morrison said, tracing one of the patterns with his finger, "they are not Christian. They speak of dark practices, of communion with evil spirits, and this book." He approached the table where Ezekiel's tome still lay open, its pages glistening with fresh blood. "Don't touch it!" Jacob cried out, but Morrison had already reached for the book. The moment his fingers made contact with the leather binding, the deacon jerked his hand back as if burned. "It's warm," Morrison said, his voice filled with horror. "The book is warm, as if it were alive, and the blood, it's still wet. Even after all these hours." The crowd began to murmur among themselves, their voices rising in fear and anger. Jacob could hear accusations being whispered. Witchcraft, devil worship, unholy covenant, the very words that had led to the deaths of 20 innocent people in Salem just months before. "Please," Jacob begged, falling to his knees before his neighbors. "You must believe me. I am innocent of this evil. The stranger Ezekiel, he knew things about me, about my past. He spoke of divine judgment and showed me visions. I think he was not what he claimed to be." "Visions?" Reverend Blackwood's voice cut through the crowd like a blade. The elderly minister had arrived and was now standing in the doorway, his weathered face grave with concern. "What manner of visions, Jacob Whitmore?" Jacob hesitated, knowing that his answer could seal his fate. But with no other choice, he began to describe the images Ezekiel had shown him, the scenes of his neighbor's secret sins, the whispered conversations about his fate, the prophecies of coming judgment. As he spoke, he saw the faces of the villagers grow increasingly hostile. "He lies," shouted Samuel Hartwell. "He seeks to deflect blame by accusing us of sin." "Aye," agreed Goodwife Fletcher, who had recovered from her faint. "He would make us all seem guilty to hide his own wickedness." Reverend Blackwood raised his hand for silence, his piercing eyes never leaving Jacob's face. "Tell me, Jacob, what became of this stranger? Where did he go?" I don't know," Jacob admitted. "I heard him leave during the night after the chanting stopped. When I emerged this morning, he was gone, leaving only this abomination behind." The minister stepped carefully into the cabin, avoiding the blood-stained patterns on the floor. He examined the walls, the ceiling, and finally the open book on the table. When he looked up, his expression was grave. "I have seen such symbols before," Blackwood said quietly, "in books confiscated from accused witches, in testimonies given during the trials in Salem. They are marks of the devil, signs of a covenant made with the powers of darkness." A collective gasp rose from the crowd, and Jacob felt his heart sink. If Reverend Blackwood, the most respected man in Millbrook, believed him guilty of witchcraft, then his fate was sealed. But The minister continued, raising his voice above the murmurs, "I have also seen the work of true evil, and this—" He gestured at the blood-covered room. "This bears the mark of something far more ancient and malevolent than any human witch could summon. A Dajjal." The crowd fell silent, waiting for the minister's judgment. Blackwood approached Jacob, who was still kneeling on the floor, and placed a weathered hand on his shoulder. "Rise, Jacob Whitmore," the minister said. "I do not believe thou art the author of this evil, but I fear thou hast been marked by it. The question now is whether thou wilt be its victim or its instrument." Jacob stood on shaking legs, hope flickering in his chest for the first time since dawn. "What do you mean, Reverend?" Blackwood's eyes were filled with a mixture of pity and determination. "I mean that whatever visited thee last night was no mere stranger, no simple prophet of God. It was something far older and more dangerous, something that has chosen thee for purposes we do not yet understand. And until we can determine what those purposes are, thou must be kept under close watch for thy own safety and for the safety of this community." The crowd began to murmur again, some voices calling for Jacob's immediate arrest, others demanding that he be driven from the village. But Reverend Blackwood's authority held sway, and gradually a plan began to take shape. Jacob would be confined to the church under guard, while the minister and the town's leaders decided what to do. The cabin would be sealed and watched in case the mysterious stranger returned. As the villagers began to disperse to make the necessary arrangements, Jacob caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. There, at the edge of the crowd, stood a familiar figure, tall, gaunt, and dressed in simple brown robes. Ezekiel was watching the proceedings with those pale, colorless eyes, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "There!" Jacob cried, pointing at the stranger. "There he is, the man I told you about." But when the villagers turned to look, they saw only empty space. Ezekiel had vanished as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving Jacob to wonder if he had imagined the entire encounter. The doubt in his neighbor's eyes returned, stronger than before, and Jacob realized that his ordeal was far from over. As he was led away to the church, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap that had been carefully laid for him. Whatever Ezekiel's true purpose, whatever dark covenant had been sealed in blood during the night, Jacob was now at the center of it all. And as the doors of the church closed behind him, he wondered if he would ever see freedom again, or if he would even want to, once he learned the full truth about what he had become. The interior of Millbrook's modest church felt more like a prison than a sanctuary, as Jacob sat in the front pew, flanked by two stern-faced men who had been appointed as his guards. The building, constructed of rough-hewn timber and fieldstone, seemed to press in around him with its austere Puritan simplicity. The only decoration was a simple wooden cross mounted behind the pulpit, its shadow falling across Jacob like an accusation. For 3 days, he had been confined here while Reverend Blackwood and the town's leaders deliberated his fate. During that time, disturbing reports had begun to filter in from around the village. Livestock had been found dead in their pens, drained of blood, but showing no signs of violence. Children had reported seeing a tall, pale figure walking through the woods at night, always just at the edge of their vision. Most troubling of all, several villagers had begun experiencing vivid nightmares filled with blood and fire. On the morning of the 4th day, the church doors opened to admit the entire adult population of Millbrook. They filed in silently, their faces grave with the weight of the decision they had come to witness. Jacob's heart sank as he saw the mixture of fear and condemnation in their eyes. Whatever Reverend Blackwood had decided, it was clear that the community had already reached its own verdict. Deacon Morrison took his place at a table that had been set up before the altar, flanked by the town's other leaders, Selectman Williams, Constable Porter, and Elder Hutchinson. Reverend Blackwood stood behind the pulpit, his weathered hands gripping the worn wood as he surveyed the assembled congregation. "We are gathered here today," the minister began, his voice carrying easily through the small building, to determine the fate of Jacob Whitmore, who stands accused of trafficking with evil spirits and bringing a curse upon our community." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Jacob felt the weight of dozens of hostile stares. He wanted to protest his innocence again, but he had learned over the past 3 days that his words carried little weight against the evidence of what had been found in his cabin. "Before we proceed," Blackwood continued, "let us hear the testimony of those who have witnessed the strange events that have plagued our village since that accursed night." One by one, the villagers came forward to give their accounts. Farmer Goodwin described finding his prize bull dead in the pasture, its body completely drained of blood, but unmarked by any wound. Goodwife Adams told of her young daughter's nightmares, in which a pale stranger whispered terrible secrets in her ear. Old Martha Prescott, the village's unofficial wise woman, spoke of sensing a malevolent presence that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. As the testimonies continued, Jacob began to see a pattern emerging. The strange events were not random. They were all connected to people who had shown him kindness in the past, or who had defended him against the whispered accusations of his neighbors. It was as if some dark force was systematically targeting anyone who might speak in his favor. "These events," Reverend Blackwood said when the last witness had spoken, "bear all the hallmarks of a supernatural curse." The question before us is whether Jacob Whitmore is the author of this evil or merely its unwitting instrument. Deacon Morrison stood, his face stern with righteous authority. "Reverend, with all due respect, the evidence seems clear. The man's cabin was found covered in blood and marked with unholy symbols. His hands bore the stains of whatever dark ritual was performed there. And now, in the days since, our community has been plagued by unnatural events. How can we conclude anything other than that he has made a pact with the devil?" A chorus of agreement rose from the congregation, and Jacob felt his last hope beginning to fade. But then, unexpectedly, a voice spoke from the back of the church. "Perhaps, Deacon Morrison, we should consider the possibility that Jacob Whitmore is not the perpetrator of these events, but their intended victim." All heads turned to see who had spoken. To Jacob's surprise, it was Dr. Cornelius Marsh, a learned man who had recently arrived in Millbrook from Boston. The doctor was known for his extensive education and his collection of books on theology and natural philosophy. His opinion carried considerable weight in the community. "Explain yourself, Dr. Marsh," Reverend Blackwood said, his tone carefully neutral. The doctor stood and made his way to the front of the church, his intelligent eyes scanning the assembled crowd. "I have spent considerable time examining the scene in Jacob's cabin, as well as researching the symbols found there. What I discovered troubles me greatly." He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio, from which he extracted several sheets of paper covered with careful drawings. "These symbols are not merely marks of witchcraft, as we initially believed. They are far older, far more dangerous. I have found references to them in texts dating back to the earliest days of Christianity, and even before." The congregation stirred uneasily as Dr. Marsh displayed his drawings. Even rendered in simple ink, the symbols seemed to writhe and shift on the page, causing several people to look away in discomfort. "According to my research," the doctor continued, "these marks are associated with entities that predate human civilization, beings of immense power and malevolence that were banished from our world in ancient times. The ritual performed in Jacob's cabin was not a simple act of witchcraft, but an attempt to create a gateway, a means for one of these entities to return." "And you believe Jacob was an unwitting participant in this ritual?" Reverend Blackwood asked, his voice tight with concern. "I believe Jacob was chosen specifically because of his isolation and vulnerability," Dr. Marsh replied. "The entity that visited him, this Ezekiel, needed someone who would be easily blamed for whatever followed, someone whose word would not be trusted, whose guilt would be readily accepted by the community. Jacob felt a surge of hope at the doctor's words, but it was quickly dampened by the skeptical murmurs from the crowd. Many of the villagers seemed unconvinced by this explanation, preferring the simpler narrative that painted Jacob as a willing servant of evil. Deacon Morrison's face was flushed with anger. "Dr. Marsh, with all due respect to your learning, you ask us to believe in fairy tales and ancient superstitions. The evidence against Jacob Whitmore is clear and undeniable. He has brought evil into our midst, and he must be held accountable." "Then explain this, Doctor," Marsh said, reaching into his portfolio again. This time, he withdrew a piece of parchment that made several people in the congregation gasp in recognition. It was a page from Ezekiel's mysterious book, somehow recovered from Jacob's cabin. "This page contains a prophecy," the doctor said, his voice growing grave. "A prophecy that describes in detail the events that have befallen our village. But more than that, it predicts what is yet to come. According to this text, the ritual in Jacob's cabin was only the beginning. The entity seeks to use our community's fear and suspicion to tear us apart from within, to create the chaos and bloodshed it needs to fully manifest in our world." The church fell silent as the implications of the doctor's words sank in. If he was right, then their persecution of Jacob was playing directly into the entity's hands. But if he was wrong, they risked allowing a dangerous witch to escape justice. Reverend Blackwood studied the parchment for a long moment, his face growing increasingly troubled. "Dr. Marsh, assuming your interpretation is correct, what would you have us do? How can we combat such an ancient evil?" "The prophecy suggests that the entity's power is tied to the community's unity," the doctor replied. "As long as we remain divided by fear and suspicion, it grows stronger. But if we can come together, if we can resist the temptation to turn on one another, we may be able to deny it the chaos it seeks." "And what of Jacob?" Morrison demanded. "Even if he is not the author of this evil, he remains its focal point. His very presence among us continues to feed the entity's power." Dr. Marsh turned to look at Jacob, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and determination. "That is true. Jacob has been marked by this entity, bound to it in ways we do not fully understand. But rather than casting him out or condemning him to death, we must find a way to break that connection." "How?" Reverend Blackwood asked. "The same texts that describe the entity's power also speak of rituals of purification and binding," the doctor explained. "Complex ceremonies that can sever the connection between the entity and its chosen vessel. But they require the willing participation of the entire community, and they carry great risk." The congregation erupted in heated discussion as the villagers debated this unexpected turn of events. Some were convinced by Dr. Marsh's arguments and willing to attempt the purification ritual. Others remained convinced that Jacob was guilty and should be dealt with accordingly. Still others wanted nothing more than to flee Millbrook entirely, leaving the evil behind them. As the debate raged around him, Jacob found himself staring at the simple wooden cross behind the pulpit. For the first time since that terrible night, he felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps there was a way out of this nightmare after all. But as he watched the faces of his neighbors, twisted with fear and suspicion, he wondered if they would be able to overcome their divisions long enough to save themselves and him. The trial was far from over, and Jacob knew that the hardest test was yet to come. For even if Dr. Marsh was right about the entity's nature and purpose, convincing the people of Millbrook to trust in an accused witch would require a miracle. And as the shadows lengthened in the church, Jacob couldn't help but wonder if any miracles were left in this dark and troubled world. The debate in the church continued well into the evening, with the congregation split almost evenly between those who believed Dr. Marsh's explanation and those who remained convinced of Jacob's guilt. As darkness fell outside, the atmosphere in the building grew increasingly tense, with voices raised in anger and fear echoing off the wooden walls. It was Reverend Blackwood who finally called for order, his authoritative voice cutting through the chaos. "Enough!" he declared, striking his staff against the floor. "We will not solve this crisis through argument and division. If Dr. Marsh is correct, then our very discord feeds the evil that plagues us." The congregation gradually fell silent, though the tension remained palpable. Jacob could see the fear in their faces, the uncertainty that gnawed at their hearts. These were simple, God-fearing people who had never encountered anything like the supernatural horror that had invaded their quiet village. "I propose," the minister continued, "that we put Dr. Marsh's theory to the test. If the purification ritual he describes can indeed break the connection between Jacob and this entity, then we will have our answer. If it fails—" He paused, his eyes finding Jacob's across the crowded church. "Then we will know that our original suspicions were correct." Deacon Morrison stood, his face flushed with indignation. "Reverend, you ask us to risk our very souls on the word of a stranger and the testimony of an accused witch. What if this ritual is itself a trap, designed to corrupt us all? Then we will face that judgment together, as a community united in faith," Blackwood replied firmly. "But I would rather risk damnation in the attempt to save an innocent man than condemn him based on fear and suspicion alone." Dr. Marsh stepped forward, his portfolio clutched tightly in his hands. "The ritual I propose is not without precedent in Christian tradition. It draws upon the same principles of confession, repentance, and communal prayer that form the foundation of our faith. The only difference is the specific words and actions required to combat this particular form of evil." He opened his portfolio and withdrew several more sheets of parchment, these covered with carefully transcribed text in multiple languages. "I have spent the past 3 days translating the relevant passages from the entity's book, cross-referencing them with other sources in my collection. The ritual must be performed at the site where the original corruption took place, Jacob's cabin, and it requires the participation of the entire community." "What exactly does this ritual entail?" asked Elder Hutchinson, his voice heavy with concern. "It begins with a cleansing of the site," Dr. Marsh explained. "The blood and symbols must be washed away with holy water blessed by the entire congregation. Then Jacob must confess his sins, not just those he may have committed, but also his doubts, his anger, his moments of weakness that may have made him vulnerable to the entity's influence." Jacob felt his stomach clench at the thought of baring his soul before the entire village, but he knew it was a small price to pay for the chance at redemption. "After the confession," the doctor continued, "the community must formally forgive Jacob and accept him back into their fellowship. This act of collective grace is what will break the entity's hold over him. Finally, we must all join together in prayer and song, creating a barrier of faith that the entity cannot penetrate." "And if it works?" asked Goodwife Fletcher, her voice barely above a whisper. "If it works, the entity will be banished back to whatever realm it came from, and our village will be free of its influence," Dr. Marsh replied. "But I must warn you all, the ritual is not without danger. The entity will not give up its hold easily, and it may attempt to strike back at us during the ceremony." A collective shudder ran through the congregation at these words. Several people began to murmur prayers under their breath, while others clutched their Bibles more tightly to their chests. Reverend Blackwood raised his hand for silence once more. "The choice before us is clear," he said solemnly. "We can continue to live in fear and suspicion, allowing this evil to tear our community apart from within. Or we can stand together in faith and attempt to drive it out. I call for a vote. All those in favor of attempting the purification ritual, raise your hands." Slowly, hesitantly, hands began to rise throughout the church. Dr. Marsh was the first, followed by Reverend Blackwood himself. Then came several of the younger villagers, those who had been less quick to judge Jacob guilty. Gradually, more hands joined them until nearly 2/3 of the congregation had voted in favor of the ritual. "It is decided," Blackwood announced. "We will attempt the purification tomorrow at sunset. Until then, I ask that you all spend time in prayer and fasting, preparing your hearts for what is to come." As the villagers began to file out of the church, Jacob felt a mixture of hope and terror wash over him. Tomorrow would determine his fate, and possibly the fate of the entire village. He only prayed that their faith would be strong enough to overcome the ancient evil that had marked him. The next day passed slowly, with an oppressive atmosphere hanging over Millbrook like a shroud. The sky was overcast, and a cold wind blew in from the north, carrying with it the scent of approaching winter. Jacob spent the day in prayer and meditation, trying to prepare himself for the ordeal ahead. As sunset approached, the entire village gathered at Jacob's cabin. The building stood empty and foreboding, its windows dark and its door sealed with boards nailed across the frame. The very air around it seemed to thrum with malevolent energy, and several of the children began to cry as they drew near. Dr. Marsh had prepared everything according to the ancient texts. Large barrels of water had been blessed by Reverend Blackwood and the other church elders, and the villagers carried buckets and brushes to scrub away the blood and symbols that still stained the interior walls. Candles and torches provided flickering light as the sun disappeared behind the horizon. "Before we begin," Reverend Blackwood announced to the assembled crowd, "let us join together in prayer, asking for God's protection and guidance in this dark hour." The villagers bowed their heads as the minister led them in a lengthy prayer, his voice strong and clear in the gathering darkness. Jacob felt tears streaming down his face as he listened to the words of faith and hope, remembering for the first time in days that he was not alone in this struggle. When the prayer ended, Dr. Marsh stepped forward with a crowbar and began removing the boards from the cabin door. As the last plank fell away, a wave of putrid air rushed out, causing several people to gag and step backward. The smell was even worse than Jacob remembered, not just blood and corruption, but something deeper and more fundamentally wrong. "Stay close together," the doctor warned as he pushed open the door. "Do not let fear separate us, for that is what the entity desires." The villagers entered the cabin in a tight group, their candles casting dancing shadows on the blood-stained walls. The symbols seemed to writhe and pulse in the flickering light, and Jacob could swear he heard whispers coming from the very walls themselves. "Begin the cleansing," Dr. Marsh commanded, and the villagers set to work with their brushes and holy water. As they scrubbed, something extraordinary began to happen. Where the blessed water touched the blood, it began to smoke and hiss as if it were acid eating through metal. The symbols seemed to fight back, growing brighter and more distinct even as they were washed away. And through it all, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, speaking words in that same ancient language Jacob had heard on the night of his encounter with Ezekiel. "Do not listen to the voices," Reverend Blackwood called out, "por favor, continue gerando a sua resposta." Expert logo teaser 1. "Do not listen to the voices," Reverend Blackwood called out above the growing cacophony. "Focus on your prayers and your work. The entity seeks to distract us from our purpose." But the whispers were becoming harder to ignore. They seemed to speak directly into each person's mind, dredging up their deepest fears and darkest secrets. Jacob saw Goodwife Fletcher stumble as the voices reminded her of her secret meetings with the traveling merchant. Deacon Morrison's face went pale as his theft from the church's poor box was whispered for all to hear, though only he could understand the words. "It's working," Dr. Marsh said through gritted teeth as he scrubbed at a particularly stubborn symbol. "The entity is losing its hold on this place. Keep going." As more of the blood was washed away, the cabin began to change. The oppressive atmosphere started to lift, and the whispers grew fainter. But just as Jacob began to hope that the worst was over, the temperature in the room plummeted. Their breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air, and frost started forming on the windows. "He comes," Dr. Marsh whispered, his eyes wide with terror. "The entity manifests. Everyone, form a circle around Jacob. Now!" The villagers quickly arranged themselves in a protective ring around Jacob, their hands joined and their voices raised in prayer. Through the frosted windows, they could see a tall figure approaching through the darkness. Ezekiel, or the thing that wore his form, moving with inhuman grace across the frozen ground. The cabin door, which had been standing open, suddenly slammed shut with tremendous force. The candles flickered and nearly went out, leaving them in near darkness. And then, impossibly, Ezekiel was inside the cabin with them, though no one had seen him enter. "So," the entity said in Ezekiel's voice, though it now carried harmonics that hurt to hear, "the sheep think to defy their shepherd. How amusing." Jacob felt the creature's pale eyes fix upon him, and he nearly collapsed under the weight of that terrible gaze. But the circle of villagers held firm, their prayers growing louder and more fervent. "You have no power here," Reverend Blackwood declared, though his voice shook with fear. "This man is under our protection, and we claim him in the name of the Almighty." Ezekiel laughed, a sound like breaking glass and screaming wind. "Your God has abandoned this place, old man." He turned his face away the moment this wretch cursed his name over the ashes of his family. "Jacob Whitmore belongs to me now, body and soul." "That's not true," Jacob cried out, finding his voice at last. "I may have spoken in anger and grief, but I never renounced my faith. I never made any pact with you or your kind. Did you not?" The entity circled the group like a predator stalking its prey. "When you welcomed me into your home, when you fed me and gave me shelter, when you listened to my words and accepted my visions, was that not covenant enough? When you allowed doubt and hatred to fill your heart as I showed you your neighbor's sins, did you not choose darkness over light?" Jacob felt the truth of those words like a physical blow. He had welcomed the stranger, had listened to his poisonous words, had allowed them to plant seeds of resentment and suspicion in his heart. Perhaps he was guilty after all. But then Dr. Marsh spoke up, his voice cutting through Jacob's despair. "Hospitality to strangers is a Christian duty. Doubt and anger are human weaknesses, not mortal sins. You prey upon the vulnerable and the grieving, but that does not make them yours by right." "Clever words, learned man," Ezekiel hissed. "But words will not save you when the blood begins to flow." The entity raised its hand, and Jacob saw that its fingers had become long, razor-sharp claws. But before it could strike, something unexpected happened. Young Samuel Hartwell, who had been one of Jacob's most vocal accusers, stepped forward and placed himself between the creature and its intended victim. "No," Samuel said, his voice trembling but determined. "I was wrong about Jacob. We all were. He's not our enemy, you are." One by one, other villagers began to step forward, adding their voices to Samuel's declaration. Even Deacon Morrison, his face streaked with tears of shame, moved to stand with Jacob. "We forgive you, Jacob Whitmore," Morrison said, his voice breaking with emotion. "For any sins you may have committed, for any doubts you may have harbored, we forgive you and welcome you back into our fellowship." The effect on the entity was immediate and dramatic. Ezekiel's form began to waver and blur, as if he were a reflection in disturbed water. His pale eyes blazed with fury as he realized what was happening. "No!" he shrieked, his voice now a cacophony of inhuman sounds. "The covenant is sealed, the blood has been spilled, he is mine!" But the villagers' voices rose in unison, drowning out the creature's protests. They began to sing, not a formal hymn, but a simple song of faith that many of them had learned as children. The melody filled the cabin, pushing back the darkness and cold. As they sang, Jacob felt something breaking inside him, not his spirit, but the invisible chains that had bound him to the entity since that terrible night. The guilt and self-doubt that had plagued him for years began to lift, replaced by a warmth that seemed to flow from the joined hands and united voices of his neighbors. Ezekiel's form continued to fade, becoming more translucent with each passing moment. "This is not over," he snarled, his voice now barely audible. "I will return, and when I do—" "You will find us ready," Reverend Blackwood interrupted firmly. "United in faith and fellowship, standing against the darkness. You have no power here, demon, be gone!" With a final, inhuman shriek, the entity vanished, leaving behind only the lingering scent of sulfur and decay. The cabin's temperature immediately began to return to normal, and the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the village for days finally lifted. Jacob collapsed to his knees, overwhelmed by relief and gratitude. Around him, his neighbors, no longer suspicious strangers but true friends, reached out to support him. For the first time since the fire that had claimed his family, Jacob felt that he truly belonged somewhere. "It is finished, Doctor," Marsh said quietly, closing his portfolio with a satisfied smile. "The entity has been banished and the connection severed. Jacob is free." But even as the villagers celebrated their victory, Jacob couldn't shake the memory of the creature's final words. This might be over, but he had the feeling that their struggle against the forces of darkness was far from finished. Still, for now, it was enough to be surrounded by friends, to know that he was no longer alone in facing whatever challenges lay ahead. As they emerged from the cabin into the clear night air, Jacob looked up at the stars and offered a silent prayer of thanksgiving. He had been tested in the crucible of fear and suspicion, and though he had nearly been consumed by it, he had emerged purified and renewed. Whatever the future might hold, he would face it not as an outcast, but as a valued member of a community bound together by faith, forgiveness, and love. 3 months had passed since the night of the purification ritual, and Millbrook had slowly begun to heal from the supernatural trauma that had nearly torn it apart. The harsh New England winter had given way to the first tentative signs of spring, and with the changing season came a sense of renewal that touched every aspect of village life. Jacob stood in the doorway of his rebuilt cabin, watching the sun rise over the fields that he had once again begun to cultivate. The structure was larger than his previous home, built with the help of his neighbors who had insisted on contributing both labor and materials. Where once there had been suspicion and isolation, now there was genuine community. The interior bore no resemblance to the blood-stained chamber of horrors it had once been. Clean wooden walls, simple but comfortable furniture, and windows that let in abundant natural light had transformed the space into a true home. Most importantly, it was filled with the sounds of life and laughter, for Jacob was no longer alone. "Good morning, Papa Jacob," came a small voice from behind him. He turned to see little Mary Fletcher, Goodwife Fletcher's youngest daughter, tugging at his coat. The child had taken to visiting him regularly, drawn by his gentle nature and the stories he told of his travels before coming to Millbrook. "Good morning, little one," Jacob replied, lifting the girl into his arms. "Have you come to help me tend the garden today?" Mary nodded enthusiastically, her blonde curls bouncing. "Mama says you grow the best vegetables in all of Millbrook. She wants to know your secret." Jacob chuckled, remembering a time when Goodwife Fletcher had viewed him with nothing but suspicion and fear. The transformation in their relationship, like so many others in the village, was nothing short of miraculous. "The secret," he said conspiratorially, "is to talk to the plants. They like to know they're appreciated." As they walked toward the garden plot behind the cabin, Jacob reflected on the changes that had swept through Millbrook in the wake of their supernatural ordeal. The shared experience of confronting true evil had broken down the barriers of mistrust and judgment that had previously divided the community. People who had barely spoken to each other before now worked together on common projects. Neighbors who had harbored secret resentments had found the courage to seek forgiveness and reconciliation. Dr. Marsh had remained in the village, establishing a small practice and becoming an invaluable member of the community. His extensive library had become a resource for the entire village, and his rational, scientific approach to problems had helped dispel many of the superstitions and fears that had previously plagued the residents. "Jacob," called a familiar voice from across the field. He looked up to see Samuel Hartwell approaching, his face bright with excitement. The young man had become one of Jacob's closest friends, their bond forged in the crucible of that terrible night when Samuel had chosen to stand with him against the entity. "What brings you here so early, Samuel?" Jacob asked, setting Mary down so she could begin her self-appointed task of inspecting the emerging seedlings. "News from Boston," Samuel replied, slightly out of breath from his hurried journey. "A merchant caravan arrived last night with word from the colonial authorities. The witch trials in Salem have finally ended. The governor has pardoned all those still imprisoned, and the court has been dissolved." Jacob felt a wave of relief wash over him. Though Millbrook had escaped the worst of the hysteria that had gripped Salem, the shadow of those trials had hung over all of New England like a dark cloud. The knowledge that innocent people were no longer being executed based on spectral evidence and forced confessions was a blessing beyond measure. "There's more," Samuel continued, his expression growing more serious. "The merchant spoke of strange events in other villages, unexplained disappearances, reports of supernatural manifestations, communities torn apart by fear and suspicion. It seems that what happened here was not an isolated incident." Jacob nodded grimly. He had suspected as much. The entity that had called itself Ezekiel had spoken of a greater purpose, a larger plan, of which Jacob's torment had been only a small part. The thought that other communities might be facing similar trials filled him with both sorrow and determination. "We should speak with Reverend Blackwood about this," Jacob said. "If our experience here has taught us anything, it's that these supernatural threats are best faced with unity and preparation." As they made their way toward the village center, Jacob noticed the changes that had transformed Millbrook over the past months. Houses that had once stood isolated behind high fences now opened directly onto common areas, where children played and adults gathered to share news and gossip. The church, once a place of stern judgment and rigid doctrine, had become a true center of community life, hosting not just religious services, but also town meetings, educational gatherings, and social events. They found Reverend Blackwood in his study, poring over a collection of letters that had arrived with the morning post. The elderly minister looked up as they entered, his weathered face creased with concern. "Ah, Jacob, Samuel," he said, gesturing for them to take seats. "I was just reading reports from my colleagues in other parishes. It seems that the darkness we faced here has indeed spread to other communities throughout New England." He held up one of the letters, his hand trembling slightly. "Reverend Williams in Hadley writes of a mysterious plague that struck his village last month. Livestock dying without cause, children falling into unexplained comas, and reports of a pale stranger who appeared just before the troubles began." Jacob felt his blood run cold. The description was all too familiar. "The same entity that visited us." "Perhaps, or one like it," Blackwood replied. "Dr. Marsh believes that our successful banishment of the creature may have forced it to seek easier prey elsewhere. Communities that lack our hard-won unity and experience may be more vulnerable to its influence." Samuel leaned forward in his chair, his young face set with determination. "Then we have a responsibility to help them, don't we? We know how to fight these things. We can't just sit here in safety while other innocent people suffer." Jacob felt a surge of pride at the young man's words. The Samuel, who had once been quick to judge and condemn, had grown into someone willing to risk himself for the sake of others. It was a transformation that spoke to the profound changes that had taken place in all of them. "I've been thinking the same thing," Blackwood said. "Dr. Marsh and I have been discussing the possibility of forming a network of communities that have faced supernatural threats, a way to share knowledge and provide mutual support when such crises arise. "It's a worthy goal," Jacob said, though he couldn't help but feel a pang of reluctance at the thought of leaving Millbrook. After years of isolation and wandering, he had finally found a place where he belonged. The idea of venturing back into a world of suspicion and danger was daunting. As if reading his thoughts, Reverend Blackwood placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I'm not suggesting that you personally travel to these troubled communities, Jacob. You've suffered enough for one lifetime. But your experience, your insights into how these entities operate, that knowledge could be invaluable to others facing similar trials." Before Jacob could respond, the study door burst open to admit Dr. Marsh, his usually composed demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. "Reverend Jacob, thank God you're here. We have a problem." "What is it?" Blackwood asked, rising from his chair. "I've been monitoring the site of Jacob's old cabin, taking regular measurements of certain atmospheric disturbances," the doctor explained, setting down a leather satchel filled with strange instruments. "This morning, I detected a significant spike in supernatural activity. Something is trying to re-establish a connection to this place." Jacob felt his heart sink. "You mean the entity is returning?" "Not the same one, I don't think, Doctor," Marsh replied, consulting a notebook filled with complex calculations. "The signature is different, weaker but more persistent. It's as if something is testing our defenses, probing for weaknesses." Samuel stood abruptly, his hand moving instinctively to the knife at his belt. "What do we do? Should we evacuate the village?" "No," Jacob said firmly, surprising himself with the strength in his voice. "Running won't solve anything. These creatures feed on fear and division. If we flee, we'll only be giving them what they want." Dr. Marsh nodded approvingly. "Jacob is right. Our best defense is the unity we've built here, but we need to be prepared for whatever comes next." Over the next several hours, word spread quickly through Millbrook about the potential supernatural threat. But instead of the panic and finger-pointing that might have occurred months earlier, the villagers responded with calm determination. They had faced such evil before and emerged victorious. They could do so again. By evening, the entire adult population of the village had gathered in the church for an emergency meeting. The atmosphere was tense but resolute, a far cry from the fearful accusations and desperate blame-seeking that had characterized their previous crisis. "We stand at a crossroads," Reverend Blackwood addressed the assembled crowd. "We can choose to live in fear, constantly looking over our shoulders for the next supernatural threat, or we can choose to stand as a beacon of hope and resistance against the forces of darkness." Jacob found himself rising to his feet, though he hadn't planned to speak. All eyes turned to him, and for a moment he was transported back to that terrible day when he had knelt before these same people, begging them to believe in his innocence. "3 months ago," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent church, "I was a broken man, consumed by grief and guilt, easy prey for the entity that sought to use me. But you, all of you, chose to see past your fears and suspicions. You chose to forgive and to trust. That choice saved not just my life, but my soul." He paused, looking around at the faces of his neighbors, people who had become his family in every way that mattered. "Now we have the opportunity to extend that same grace to others who are facing the darkness we once knew. Dr. Marsh speaks of forming a network of communities, sharing our knowledge and experience. I believe we should do more than that." "What do you propose?" asked Deacon Morrison, his tone respectful rather than challenging. "I propose that we become active defenders against these supernatural threats," Jacob said, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "Not just for our own protection, but for the sake of all innocent people who might fall victim to such evil. We have learned how to fight these creatures. We have learned the power of unity and forgiveness. That knowledge is too valuable to keep to ourselves." A murmur of agreement rippled through the congregation. Samuel stood up, followed by several other young men and women. "I'll go wherever you need me to go," Samuel declared. "These entities have taken enough innocent lives. It's time to take the fight to them." Dr. Marsh stepped forward, his scientific instruments glinting in the candlelight. "I can provide the knowledge and tools necessary to detect and combat supernatural manifestations. But we'll need more than just information. We'll need people with the courage and faith to stand against forces that most would flee from." "You'll have them," Reverend Blackwood said solemnly. "Millbrook will be the first community in what I pray will become a network of light in the growing darkness. We will train defenders, share our knowledge, and stand ready to aid any community that faces the kind of evil we have overcome." As the meeting continued late into the night, plans began to take shape. They would establish a training program for young volunteers, teaching them to recognize the signs of supernatural influence and the techniques for combating it. Dr. Marsh would work to expand his library of knowledge about such entities, while Reverend Blackwood would reach out to his colleagues in other parishes to identify communities in need of assistance. Most importantly, they would maintain the unity and mutual support that had been their greatest weapon against the darkness. For Jacob had learned that no supernatural entity, no matter how ancient or powerful, could stand against a community bound together by genuine love and trust. As the villagers finally began to disperse to their homes, Jacob lingered in the church, kneeling before the simple wooden cross that had witnessed so much pain and redemption. The man who had once cursed God in his grief had found his way back to faith through the kindness of others. Now he would spend the rest of his life ensuring that others could find the same path. Outside, the first light of dawn was beginning to touch the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. It was a new day, not just for Jacob or for Millbrook, but for all those who would benefit from the light they had chosen to kindle in the darkness. The supernatural threats were far from over. Dr. Marsh's instruments continued to detect disturbing signs from across New England. But Jacob no longer faced the future with fear. He had learned that even the darkest night must eventually give way to dawn, and that no evil could ultimately triumph over a community united in love and purpose. As he finally made his way home to his rebuilt cabin, Jacob offered a prayer of gratitude for the journey that had brought him to this moment. He had lost everything once: his family, his home, his faith in humanity. But in losing everything, he had found something even more precious, a true understanding of what it meant to belong to a community, and the strength that came from standing together against the darkness. The pale stranger who had called himself Ezekiel had sought to use Jacob's isolation and despair as weapons against the innocent. Instead, that encounter had forged him into something stronger, a defender of the light, a guardian against the supernatural threats that lurked at the edges of the civilized world. And as the sun rose fully over the peaceful village of Millbrook, Jacob Whitmore smiled and began to plan for the battles yet to come. For he knew now that no matter how dark the night might become, there would always be those willing to stand against the darkness, united in faith and bound together by the unbreakable bonds of human compassion. The story of the poor man who fed a wandering prophet had become something far greater than a tale of supernatural horror. It had become a testament to the power of redemption, the strength of community, and the eternal truth that light will always triumph over darkness, as long as there are those brave enough to kindle the flame.